Hi, everyone. Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Lauren Artilles, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm excited to introduce this virtual event with Terry Greene Sterling and Jude Joffe-Block, presenting their new book, Driving While Brown, Sheriff Joe Arpaio versus the Latino Resistance, moderated by Walter V. Robinson. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually today. Through virtual events like this afternoon's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. We're hosting events every weeknight right here on Zoom. And just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, where you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. Today's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. So if you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Driving While Brown on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over this past year, technical issues may arise. So if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I am pleased to introduce our speakers. Terry Greene Sterling is affiliated faculty and writer in residence at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University and editor at large for the Arizona Center of Investigative Reporting. She has written one other book, Illegal. Her writing has been published in the Washington Post, Rolling Stone, Newsweek, The Atlantic, Slate, The Daily Beast, The Village Voice, High Country News, The Guardian, and many other publications. The Arizona Press Club has named her the state's top journalist 3 times. Jude Joffe-Block joined the Associated Press in 2020 as a reporter and editor working in both English and Spanish on the news verification team. Before that, she reported on immigration for more than a decade at outlets that include NPR and The Guardian. She was a visiting journalist at the Russell Sage Foundation and a fellow with New America, the Center for the Future of Arizona, and the Logan Nonfiction Program while co-authoring this book. And she began her journalism career in Mexico. Joining them in conversation today is Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Walter V. Robinson, who led the Spotlight team's investigation that uncovered the Catholic Church sexual abuse scandal. He has been city editor, metro editor, White House correspondent, and foreign correspondent, and he has reported for the Boston Globe from 48 states and more than 30 countries. Today, they'll be discussing Terry and Jude's new co-authored book, the result of years of reportage on Sheriff Joe Arpaio's relentless immigration enforcement in Maricopa County, Arizona, and the Latinx-led resistance fighting back against it. Cecilia Menjivar says, Driving While Brown reads like a novel and is at once a rich, intimate portrayal of the excesses of immigration enforcement in one locality in the country, as well as an analysis of the forces and power dynamics that make these repressive practices possible in the rest of the country. And Ricardo Sandoval Palos calls Driving While Brown an engaging chronicle of hate disguised as populism, from its short shelf life to how it inspired courageous activists to stand up, push back, and launch a movement that's remaking our political landscape. Without further ado, I'm excited to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Jude, Terry, and Robbie.
Great. So we're going to start with a short presentation. So I'm going to just share my screen.
Hi there, I'm Terry Greene Sterling, and I want to thank you for joining us. I want to talk a tiny bit about what brought me to write this book with Jude. I was born into an Arizona Sonora borderlands family, and I have spent much of my life writing about the people, the places, and the politics of the borderlands. I have interviewed and written about Joe Arpaio for many, many years, and not only for magazines and newspapers, but for a previous book, and now for this book. I am happy to share my thoughts and insights and my experiences based on these years of reporting.
And hello, thanks for joining us. I'm Jude Joffe-Block, and I started covering former Sheriff Joe Arpaio back in 2012. At that time, I was a public radio reporter. And our book draws on about 30 interviews that we did with Arpaio over the years, as well as interviews with about 100 other people who either opposed him, supported him, or factored into the story in some other way, plus thousands of pages of public records. And as a journalist, I won't be sharing my opinion today, just reporting and analysis. And we have a short multimedia presentation to introduce you to the book.
This is a book about a powerful local sheriff known throughout the world for his immigration crackdowns. Because he's known to retaliate against his peers and against his critics, rather, few have the courage to stand up to him. But a Latino resistance rises up against Arpaio at great risk. And they also rise up against new laws in Arizona that are intended to criminalize and deport immigrants. This is a book from a macro level about a battle for America in a time of demographic change and unconstitutional policing.
And we titled our book Driving While Brown because of the history of people of Mexican descent in Arizona feeling targeted by immigration-themed traffic stops. And Danny Ortega, who's pictured here and is featured in the book, he was born in this country and explained to us how some of the earlier attacks on immigrants, even prior to Arpaio, felt like an attack on him. And he was a young man in the 1970s when the Peoria Police Department, which is outside of Phoenix, began targeting farm workers in traffic stops to check their papers.
People were being stopped because they were brown, driving while brown, okay? And so we saw this not only as an attack on the undocumented community, but we saw it as an attack on us, simply because of the features of our skin and our hair color and our language.
So let's turn our attention back just for a second to Joe Arpaio. Who is this guy? He is the son of an unwanted immigrant who becomes the bane of unwanted immigrants. He spends 20 years in federal drug enforcement, where he develops a love for getting in the media, a fondness for conspiracy theories, and a knack for becoming a fictitious character in undercover work. He retires in Phoenix and runs for sheriff in 1992. Here he creates a new persona, a new character for himself as America's toughest sheriff. In the early 2000s, a movement starts building in Arizona to restrict and punish unauthorized immigration from Mexico and Central America. Arpaio does not initially embrace that cause, but he pivots in 2006 after he sees it's popular with his base.
And in 2007, he signs up for a federal partnership to enforce immigration laws. And in the past, only federal agents could arrest immigrants for being undocumented, which is technically a civil violation, not a criminal one. But Arpaio sought to change that. And this is him at a 2007 press conference. Oops, let me try that again.
My program, my philosophy is a pure program. You go after illegals. I'm not afraid to say that. And you go after them and you lock them up.
And Arpaio soon starts massive neighborhood sweeps. His deputies pull over cars for minor traffic violations like cracked windshields, broken taillights, and suspected undocumented immigrants who are either driving or as passengers are turned over to ICE for deportation. And Latino drivers and passengers also feel that they too are being targeted, even those who are US citizens or have permanent residency or other kinds of immigration status. And this is a scene from the documentary Two Americans that I'm about to play. And it shows footage from a range of those sweeps. And you'll see in this clip some of the activists that we write about in the book who showed up to the site of these sweeps to urge those who were being arrested not to say anything, to ask for a lawyer, to not sign away and agree to a voluntary deportation.
Solamente su nombre, no coopere, no coopere, es solamente su nombre, tiene el derecho a un abogado.
I mean, there was no reason to pull me over at all. There was no reason. I wasn't a speed. I didn't do any violation. I think it's the way I look. I look Hispanic, and I am Hispanic.
Joven, tiene el derecho a un abogado, no sea intimidado. Le van a preguntar por dónde entró, con quién entró, en dónde vive, dónde está su esposa. No conteste.
You stopped cars for having broken windshields and burnt out taillights. Explain how that is law enforcement. Explain that, Arpaio. Explain how that makes you a tough sheriff in America.
Muchachos, ¿qué se siente? ¿Tienen algo que decir, muchachos? Ellos están aquí por eso. Todos los mexicanos que tratan de buscar trabajo no están aquí por crímenes. Esa es mentira. Esa es una mentira muy grande.
We are under attack.
¡No firmes! ¡No firmes!
Conteste su nombre, no conteste preguntas.
Eso es lo que quiero que sepan. Y a todas las familias que se cuiden porque esto parece un infierno. Arizona se está convirtiendo en un infierno para los hispanos.
Los van a querer intimidar. Los van a querer intimidar. Pidan por un abogado.
Oops. Sorry about that. And so there was another tactic as well that Arpaio used, which was these worksite raids, and that's what's pictured here. Undocumented workers who didn't have authorization to work in the United States would be arrested on felony charges and turned over to ICE for deportation.
So who is in the resistance? People who are indigenous, immigrant day laborers, Mexican Americans, older Chicanos, children of immigrants, young Latinx activists, their allies. All of these people join the resistance to stop Arpaio. This is one member of the resistance who is featured in our book, Carlos Garcia, who had been an undocumented immigrant for a time in the United States and spent every waking hour of his day trying to figure out how to stop Arpaio with really colorful street actions. And this is Arpaio's counterbalance in our book. Lydia Guzman, she ramps up throughout our book, she ramps up her activism as Arpaio ramps up his enforcement. She is motivated by the terror that you just saw in the film clip. She sees it in real time. She sees it day after day. She takes down the names and the contact info of people who were impacted by the raids. And many of these folks later join a racial profiling lawsuit against Arpaio and his agency. This is a very famous lawsuit, and it is called Melendres v. Arpaio.
And in 2012, that case goes to trial, and the plaintiffs, who are Latino drivers and passengers, have to prove Arpaio's tactics discriminated against them.
So on the witness stand, Arpaio presents himself much differently than you saw in the little video clip that you showed of him, that we showed of him. On the witness stand, he presents as an old man who is tired and confused, and he repeatedly denies wrongdoing.
A federal judge finds Arpaio's tactics are unconstitutional, and he orders sweeping reforms to prevent profiling. And at this point, Arpaio no longer, by 2010, 2009, in fact, Arpaio had lost that federal partnership with ICE to enforce immigration laws. And this judge bars him as early as 2011 from arresting immigrants who haven't committed any crimes. Later, it comes out that the judge learns that Arpaio ignored that court order and kept making immigration arrests. And as a result of that, members of the resistance pushed for Arpaio to be punished and prosecuted for criminal contempt of court. And this is Viridiana Hernandez. She's a dreamer who has been active since she was a teenager in election fights and also in immigrant rights. And this is her at a protest outside of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Phoenix.
Arrest Arpaio. He has done enough crime. He has done enough suffering. He has done enough pain, and our community will not take it anymore.
In the meantime, Arpaio has a distraction from his legal problems, and that distraction is Donald Trump. Arpaio endorses Trump very early in Trump's presidential bid, and Trump and Arpaio have a mutual admiration society. Trump sees Arpaio's tactics and how they resonate with a white base, the same white base that Trump is courting. And activists see a striking similarity between the two men and their policies, and they begin calling Trump the national Arpaio.
And many of the activists who'd been battling Arpaio for years launched a campaign called Basta Arpaio to get him out of office in 2016. And they mobilized voters who did not have a history of voting.
So finally, after 24 years, Arpaio loses his reelection bid for sheriff of Maricopa County. This is in 2016. Many voters now view Arpaio as a ruthless civil rights violator, as a symbol of white supremacy in law enforcement, as an old man who is an expensive embarrassment to Arizona. The resistance has prevailed, but there is more work to be done, and they set their sights on Arpaio-like policies in the jails and other discriminatory policing practices on the streets of Phoenix and Maricopa County, and actually all over Arizona. After a criminal trial, Arpaio is indeed found guilty of criminal contempt of court for disobeying the federal judge. And before Arpaio is sentenced, his friend Donald Trump gives Arpaio his first presidential pardon.
And there's an immediate backlash to this pardon and criticism of Trump for this decision. And we meet with Arpaio right after, in the wake of it, and he shares his reaction to that backlash.
I got two new titles now. The disgraced sheriff, that's everywhere. Disgraced sheriff. And the other one is racist. So I got two new titles. I lost my America's Toughest Sheriff title.
And Arpaio later tries running for office again, but he's not successful, though he did come pretty close in the 2020 Republican primary for sheriff to get his old seat back. But the Democrat prevailed in that race. But the grassroots efforts to mobilize voters of color in Arizona continues. And Maria Castro, who'd walked neighborhoods trying to get out the vote since she was a high schooler in 2011, told us she'd never seen voters as excited to participate as she did in 2020. And that excitement is one reason Arizona turned blue in the 2020 presidential election. And Maria Castro told us, I think the defeat of Joe Arpaio made it tangible that we can defeat the villains that haunt our dreams. And that concludes our presentation.
Good afternoon here in Boston. Good morning to you in Phoenix, Jude and Terry. This is just a fabulous story, so well told. And every time I go to a book event for a fellow journalist, I've got one question that I have to get at, and when you're into a story and it's an important story, when do you begin to think, and how did you do this in this case, that maybe this is bigger, maybe there's a book? How did that, talk about that evolution just a little bit, both of you, if you could.
Well, I think we both recognized that it was a big story pretty early on. We met in 2012 when we were both covering the Melendrez case. I was covering it for National Journal magazine, and Jude was covering it for KJZZ Fronteras desk. And Jude and I think were the most fascinated people possibly in the room. And I'd never met anyone who had so much fascination for this story as I had, and who understood the broader implications. So we decided to do a book. We started working on our pitch about 2015. A few years later, after some of the legal processes had gone through the courts. And we started in 2016, and we were right. I mean, this is a big book, and we're thrilled that we got to write it.
I mean, what was interesting about the process, though, in this case, was that the book just got bigger. The story got bigger and bigger as we were already writing it. And so when we were writing our book proposal, Donald Trump was not on the radar as a presidential candidate yet. We didn't know that there would be a resurgence of some of the same immigration enforcement themes that had dominated Arizona politics, that would become a national fervor under Trump and his base, that we didn't know that was coming. We also didn't know that Arpaio would be found in criminal contempt of court, or that he would help Donald Trump get elected, and that Donald Trump would help him back by pardoning him, and or that Arizona would turn into a swing state in 2020. So all of these events unfolded as we were reporting in real time, but they all, it all became a bigger story and a bigger arc that we were able to encapsulate. And really, at the end of the day, the book does show this trajectory that Arizona has been on of incredible dynamic change over the last decade and a half.
Right.
And in this case, how does the notion that this is a bigger story, which most journalists would say, okay, let me write a series of articles. What is it about this issue that tipped you over? This has to be a book. In other words, what had been missing, if anything, from the public dialogue that the book hopes to achieve?
Right.
That's such a great question. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, we were told for the audience, Robbie wants us to do a conversation. So you'll hear us on occasion, both trying to talk at once. But okay, so Jude, do you want to take it, and then I'll take it?
Well, for me, it was the frustration working in public radio that I felt like I was documenting something historical in the courtroom, that there was this civil rights battle playing out in front of us, but turning it into a 3-minute or a 4-minute feature with a court update was just kind of like, every time it was missing the bigger context. There was no way to sort of put that human element. I mean, what Viridiana Hernandez, the filmmaker behind Two Americans, was able to capture in that video clip that we showed, this very human story about people feeling fear, people feeling like driven to stand up, people fighting for rights, fighting for the right to feel American. All of that was, or being treated equally as Americans, all of that was missing in these legal updates in this very important court case, but it wasn't getting to the heart of the matter. And it felt like we needed more space to include that human element.
And for me, as a long form magazine writer, I had written long pieces about Arpaio and about what was happening for many years. But even a long piece, even a 5,000 word magazine piece, doesn't properly tell the whole story of the men and women who were in the resistance, and the men and I mean, everyone who was in Arpaio's camp, and why Arpaio had so much support. And, you know, we wanted to put in historical context, starting with the end of the Mexican-American War and the annexation of Arizona into the United States. And we wanted to bring in Arizona's role in the Civil War and how that impacted later politics. So there was a lot that we just, that as a writer, I couldn't even fit in a 5,000 or 6,000 word piece. And the other thing that we had that was really fresh and really new that no one else really had was, you know, we had the space in the book to be able to really get to know the people in the book, as I said, members of the resistance, Arpaio, his supporters. We had the luxury of being able to interview them for many, many hours over time. And you just can't do that with a magazine story. The deadline's too fast and not enough space.
Yeah, and that prompts me to ask, I want to ask you this question. When you spend this amount of time, the two of you, talking and getting to know people who have literally been run over by institutions that are supposed to protect them, that's pretty tough stuff to deal with. How did you approach and deal with the Mexican-American community, the Latino community, in a way that didn't, say, bring back horrible memories for them or re-traumatize them? And how did this affect the two of you?
No, I think it's a really important question. There were times when interviews became very heavy for people, and what we tried to do was to explain.
What do you mean by heavy?
Yeah, I mean, there were tears, you know, when people were telling us about some of the most painful memories that they had lived through. And
were those your tears?
Oh, no. Well, I mean, sometimes, yeah, if somebody's crying in front of me, I mean, it's incredibly emotional. And so these were emotional interviews at times. And I think just trying to be upfront ahead of time, warning people what we're hoping to talk about, and then making sure that we have consent to keep going, and that the person wants to keep going. And we found that the people whose stories we told did want their stories to be told. And then, you know, what we have heard as feedback is that, you know, the book coming out has been bittersweet in some ways for those who have gone back to read it and say, you know, it brought me back to some of those times, and that was really hard. And so I think it's something that journalists are becoming more and more conscious of, and I'm really glad to see that we need to be trauma aware in our interview techniques and in our approaches to people, and make sure that people are ready and in a place where they are voluntarily sharing that and have planned to do so.
Okay. And I have to ask this question, and I actually wrote this down because of all the minor points I want to raise. If the bookstore invited people to a book event about somebody who is ignorant, lightly educated, a bigot who peddles untruths and coddles his base by playing to their fears, especially about immigrants, and who needs constant affirmation, people would say, another book about our ex-president? So how did, can you talk a little bit outside the policy area about how the two men are alike or were alike in their public position? What were the parallels that you saw?
Well, there were so many. Some of them were very, you know, some of them were just serendipitous. They were, and then I'll tell you the light ones first, and then I'll tell you the heavy ones after that. But some of the silly things, they were both born on the same day, and they both had the song was Frank Sinatra's My Way. But they both had this, they both, in my view, they both have a yearning for approbation, for attention, for power, and they denigrate, they denigrate immigrants in a way that is actually pretty frightening, because it's not true. They appeal to, they'll go wherever their base wants them to go, and they're both authoritarians. It took, with people like Trump and Arpaio, checks and balances don't work. It takes more than that to stop them. And that's why the resistance was so effective, because they did more than just work in the courts and the voting booths. They worked in the public square. So there's a question in the Q&A also about Trump, I think.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, just to follow on, were they both vindictive?
Oh, yes. Yes, they both, Arpaio was, he would have his deputies would park their cars outside of the homes of people who criticized him. There were many court cases that came out that showed that Arpaio had been involved in investigations of his foes that were later debunked. Some of these foes were subsequently indicted in career ruining ways. And so the result was, as with Trump, for a long time in Arizona, white Republicans, or any Republicans for that matter, few Republicans had the courage to stand up to Arpaio. And so it really took this massive resistance to stop him, because the checks and balances had broken. They didn't work anymore.
There is a question related to this in the queue. Essentially asks, are there followers of Arpaio who continue to spread his influence throughout Arizona?
That's an interesting question. Arpaio still has some supporters. He was once one of the most popular politicians in the state. Just off the charts polling. The last couple times the last 3 times he's run for office, he's not been successful. Though in this last 2020 Republican primary, it was a close one. His chief deputy ended up beating him out. It also should be noted that he is going to turn 89 in June. He's not a young man. And so it's kind of hard to win office at that age. So I think that there are people who are still trying to get his endorsement, and people who from all over the country who continue to donate to his campaigns. But in many ways, his base and his reach and his popularity, I think, is as much a national phenomenon as it is an Arizona phenomenon at this point. I think that there's some Arizonans who once supported him who turned against him, and he still has people who follow him on social media and encourage him or show up to his events from all over the country as well. But we're not seeing his brand as much in the issue of immigration in Arizona on the state and local level has been pretty quiet. Maybe it's starting to change a little bit with what's happening at the border now, but we saw a long period, basically, that there was almost immigration fatigue, where it became clear that after Senate Bill 1070, which passed in 2010, which was Arizona's famous immigration law, there was such a backlash to that and national attention and a boycott. And Arizona was the butt of all these jokes and was seen as a place that was hostile to immigrants and racist, that whole consequence of Senate Bill 1070 really, in the period after that, the number of attempts by the state legislature and other kinds of local politicians to tackle immigration really quieted down after that. We haven't yet seen a big resurgence. There's been a few efforts, and the resistance we write about at the book has been able to squash those efforts whenever they've come up. So there was a bill a couple of years ago that they managed to lobby around and kill. So it's yet, but I think that this issue of immigration kind of comes in cycles, and that I don't know that it's one trajectory. I think that we will continue to see a resurgence at some later point, and maybe it's what's happening at the border now, or maybe it's a whole different refugee population in the future that we can't even imagine. But I mean, that's what I think history has shown us, is that this is a cyclical pattern.
One non-existent parallel is that Arpaio has lost his influence, but Trump obviously maintains control of the Republican Party nationally.
Yeah. Can I just jump in there?
Yeah, sure.
I covered the 2016 Republican Watch Party, where party loyalists go to a big hotel and watch the election returns come in. And Arpaio was clearly losing. And I was asking, these people who I assumed were, Arpaio fans, what they thought about that, what were their reactions. And they were saying, hey, yeah, it's too bad, Joe's a good guy, but we got Trump. So I think that a lot of the enthusiasm over Arpaio transferred to enthusiasm for Trump. So I think a lot of that, support eroded away from Arpaio and went to Trump. And I think we have some questions and something about the Arizona election or something.
Yeah. Let me get to the questions. We have one from Joe Rusomano.
Yeah, Joe.
One of the great political scientists in any state, but in Arizona, and he says, what is it about Arizona and Maricopa County that showed the rise of someone that allowed the rise of someone like Arpaio? And I should note for our Boston listeners, Maricopa County is metropolitan Phoenix, and it has about 62.4% of the state's population, last I checked. Go ahead.
Well, it's my view that part of Phoenix's, Maricopa County's sort of organic conservatism stems really from the days of Phoenix's founding. It was founded on, it had been, the area now known in Phoenix had been an indigenous community and area for thousands of years. But White Phoenix was founded by a Confederate soldier. And I think, and after the Civil War, many Confederate folks came to Arizona and settled in Maricopa County to farm cotton. And they prospered and they became thought leaders, and sort of the atmosphere in Maricopa County, this, white atmosphere, and these very ultra conservative politics drew like-minded people from all over the country to settle in Maricopa County. And that became the political base. Now, what's happened now is that the demography is changing, and we have a very, quite a large Latino population and a good-sized indigenous population. And I believe that base is fighting as hard as it can right now to maintain power. And I think that's why you see, the Maricopa County, the elections going on, the election count, re-election, whatever they're doing at the stadium. That's why you see it going on in Maricopa County, the famous voter recount.
Okay, here's a somewhat related question. Could you talk about the ways, if possible, the accusations of 2020 election fraud contributed to the racial and ethnic strife in Arizona? Were those accusations a continuation of the narratives Arpaio had been peddling throughout his career?
Well, I think it's notable that that there's been a long struggle in Arizona about voting rights that are tied into racial justice issues. Arizona once had literacy tests that discriminated against Spanish speakers. Arizona used to be a state before the Supreme Court changed the rules on this, but back when states that were known for disenfranchising voters of color had to get any kind of election rules approved from the Justice Department under Section 5 of the Civil Rights legislation, Arizona was one of those states because of this history of disenfranchising people. And so the story of the Latino vote gaining momentum and I want to put Latino vote in quotes because, as we know, this is a problematic term. It's not a monolith, but in Arizona, it's a heavily Mexican American population. It's has tended to not be as divided as a community politically as in some other places. So the mobilization of this vote that we've seen in the last few years, the efforts to register new voters, engage new voters, if we take the long view, this is part of a long history of racial injustice that is being rectified through these voter outreach efforts. So I think in that way, there's a connection. I think that there's people who feel like even in recent history, there's been efforts that have made some of the election rules in Arizona not particularly favorable to low income and communities of color. And some of those rules had been changing in ways that were more inclusive up until recently. And now in the wake of the 2020 election, we're seeing new initiatives and a new law that was just signed by our governor that will make it more difficult for more people to participate, all in the name of election integrity. But as we know, as a way to placate those who believe that there was fraud, even though there's no evidence of such.
Yeah.
Right,
But,
so it's an extension. Yeah, you told me to interrupt, so I'm going to interrupt.
Well, yeah, but I had the right to interrupt you, but I've got, we have two related questions on the issue of racism. And let me, they're both comments, although one of them asks you two to comment. And they are these. As an interracial couple, we are stared at in Prescott by so many people. Racist attitudes are widespread. And here's the other. Please comment. Our daughter, who is half Black and half white, was a public defender in Phoenix in 2019. She was pulled aside by police because she had Virginia plates, and soon the white policeman pulled a gun on her. Can you talk a little bit about those related issues and whether you see Arizona being different, worse than other states in the country?
One of the problems with the Melendez lawsuit that, excuse me, speaks directly to this question is that the Melendez lawsuit identified racial profiling via Latino surnames. And so there were many people of color, anecdotally, who came forward and said, hey, wait a minute, I was stopped too, as in this particular anecdote. So there is an ongoing effort in Arizona led by the resistance, but also by those with intersectional interests to stop unconstitutional policing, unconstitutional traffic stops. The part about Prescott does not surprise me at all. I grew up on a cattle ranch outside of Prescott, and I can tell you from my own experience that Prescott is one of the most white and Republican conservative towns in Arizona. And many people in Prescott are resistant to demographic change or to any change at all. So yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. I had a question. I wanted to ask about how was it that Joe Arpaio got away with this for so long in Arizona by doing what he was doing in plain sight? And I have to. This is a question from an investigative reporter, you know, and it's this. Who coddled him? Who turned their eye? Who turned their eye? Who looked the other way? Was it just Republicans, or did people generally look the other way? For instance, was there bipartisan support for prisoners wearing pink? Did the establishment media give him a free ride because he was good copy?
Okay, that's a multi-pronged question.
You want me to repeat it?
No, I don't want to interrupt you. I think I've been a journalist in Phoenix for many years, and I spent 14 years working for the Alternative Weekly. I was a staff writer there. And for a long time, the Alt Weekly was the only newspaper in town that had the guts to take on Arpaio. And what was going on with the pink underwear, which was widely viewed by many as a humiliation of inmates to get publicity, all of that distracted from the wrongful death lawsuits going through the courts and the problems in the jails. There were many allegations of a culture of incredible cruelty and inhumanity in the jails, but that was sort of hidden away, or pink underwear sort of took the attention away from that. And I did not, in my early years, as in Arpaio's early years, when I was reporting, I didn't see any meaningful reporting on the jail situation from the mainstream media. That eventually changed, and it changed in part because of the resistance to Arpaio's immigration enforcement. And then the mainstream media did remarkably good work. But in the early days, I think the mainstream media pretty much enabled him. They just, didn't question him. We did that at the Alt Weekly.
The same has been said of the man to whom we're comparing him today. Is that? I mean, that's the case. That the so-called establishment media didn't look beneath the surface and didn't really question many of the things that either one of these men did or said at the time. One question I have to ask, as a reporter who understands, as we all do, how skeptical readers sometimes are of our work and where we get our information, there's a substantial part of this book which essentially tells us everything you reported, what the source was, where you got it. Why did you do that?
I felt like we wanted to keep track of that for ourselves, clearly, as we were going, especially for something where you're working on it for many years between two people. That documentation is really important for just knowing how you know stuff. And then, because we knew how we knew, we thought it would be more of a resource to share that. So a lot of the information, for example, comes from court records. We could have just said court records, but hey, why not tell you exactly which one? So I think that, I hope that this book can be a tool for, other historians or other journalists or other people who want to dig into this history. And so the more that we could make it transparent where the information came from, the more useful we thought it would be to the as a public service.
And go ahead.
It's a narrative nonfiction book, which means that we take the techniques of novel writing, character, attention, telling detail. We try to tell the story, tell the true story with as much of a narrative style as possible so that you will be interested and engaged with the characters and travel with them throughout the story. So the smartest thing to do was to take all of our attribution and put it in endnotes so that the attribution didn't get in the way of the story. But of course, no matter what, we would have attributed, right? I mean, that's what we do as journalists. It's just that to have all the attribution in the back and endnotes is a more user-friendly way to tell a story.
And it's also very, very impressive, the amount of documentation. We have some more questions. Here's one. You mentioned that there were so many details and stories that you couldn't make this an article. But were there any details that didn't make it into the book that you wish had been there?
This, I mean, for me, coming from broadcast, I thought, wow, we have 100,000 words. This is going to be amazing. And then you wouldn't believe how fast you can use up 100,000 words. And so, I mean, that for me was the biggest part of this learning curve, was realizing that we still couldn't tell the full story. Absolutely. There's so much that got left out. There are people who, I mean, we could have reorganized this and, put the camera lens on a whole different group of people and still had a fascinating, important book. Yeah. That we had our reasons for why we chose to put the lens where we did. And I'm happy we did so, but there are so many people who lived this story. There are so many people who sacrificed, who were personally impacted, people who were undocumented and put themselves at risk by being arrested to protest Arpaio, whose family members were deported. There's so many individual stories that we weren't able to capture. At a certain point we realized, I mean, we're kind of pushing it as it is in the book. We introduced the reader to a lot of people along the way, and it's a lot to ask of a reader to meet that many people. So there got to a point where we just couldn't really introduce anyone else, but there are so many people whose stories belong to be documented as part of this history.
Yeah, I would just say, for my part, everyone has a fascinating story, and it's our job as journalists and to tell those fascinating stories. But I think I was very mindful of the length and of keeping the narrative moving. So I would not. Yeah, we cut stuff that I adored, and that I fought to keep in, but we just could not. And Jude, had stuff that she adored that we couldn't keep in either because of the word count. But I think as far as this one book goes, there's nothing, even though I was upset that we took stuff out, there's nothing that I would put back in or that I feel sorry that we left out, because the book couldn't take anymore. I mean, it's got as much as it possibly can have in it and still tell a story.
Okay. We have another question. The overt racism of Trump and his administration's policies opened many people's eyes to injustices against immigrant community, if they weren't already aware. As the Biden administration has continued mass deportations despite his campaign promises, how can people continue to amplify the work of Latinx and other activists and keep the energy going in the absence of a Trump-like figure making this violence so obvious?
I think it's a really important point that that people who didn't seem to be aware of some of the issues facing immigrants in the Obama administration noticed during the Trump administration, and some of the practices were sometimes the same that caused outrage and shock. And that was very frustrating to a lot of people in the immigrant rights community, that, wait, okay, we have all these allies now. Where were you before? It's because you don't like Trump, and now you see, but are you still going to care about this issue if there's a Democrat in the White House? And I think that that's a really important issue, and it's something to be aware of how siloed we are as a country, and how sometimes these issues become part of partisan reckoning, and the reason that we care in the first place gets tied up in these partisan silos. And so I think it's a really important point to recognize. And I think it's something that, there's also an element where both Arpaio and Trump made what they were doing incredibly public, but some of what they were doing was sort of standard in other law enforcement agencies or under other administrations. They just weren't talked about in the same way. And so I think it raises a lot of great questions about how the presentation of issues and who the messenger is can inspire a much different reaction from the public.
Okay. I had a question about the parallel between Arizona and the country as a whole, and that is during the 2020 election, were there lessons that activists around the country who were trying to get rid of Trump that they learned from what had happened in Arizona in taking on Joe Arpaio?
They certainly should have, I think. And I that's a really, I would love to know more about that too. I think the Arizona case study shows that when there is a threat and the community can rally around it and then have some victories, it kind of begets more victories. It showed that if we can win this one, we can win the next one, and then you get an exponential return on that investment. And so I think there are lessons here that translate. I think one thing that we were told by the organizers on the ground, that it wasn't some of what mobilized communities of color in Arizona wasn't necessarily the Democratic Party infrastructure as much as these other grassroots organizations. Right. Though what's interesting now in Arizona is that the head of the Arizona Democratic Party, Raquel Teran, who's a state legislator, she came out of this movement. So she was a young woman who was part of this anti-Arpaio organizing for a very long time before she entered politics, and now is with the Democratic Party. So that's somebody who's bringing together the party with this grassroots movement, and it'll be interesting to see how that translates to the political issues.
And for those of us here in Massachusetts, what are the chances that the Republican stronghold on state offices is going to be loosened by the Democrats? Any chance that the Democrats will take the majority?
I think that a lot is going to have to do with sort of how easy it is to vote is going to, that the voter laws are a big part of this equation. I also think that so far the backlash to immigration and Arpaio has led people towards Democrats, but I also don't know that that's a guarantee that will, I think there's certain progressive people who want immigration reform who might end up disenchanted with the Democratic Party if they don't get what they're looking for out of it. So I think there's a lot of unknowns about how things could go. I think Arizona's really in a state of flux right now. I mean, it's certainly a battleground.
Carrie, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I've been thinking, listening to this conversation, and the one thing that we have to be mindful of is that we're in a moment in history in which it's a moment of reckoning in the United States, in which people who are not people of color recognize what Americans of color have gone through and are going through now. And I think that adds a new dynamic to this effort to to mobilize voters and to resist civil rights abuses and unconstitutional policing. On our book talks, very often we hear from people who are not of color saying, hey, we want to help. How do we help? And I think that, if folks can harness that element and that enthusiasm and that drive, it will be more effective as Trump is gone, as Trump sort of is gone from the stage. In answer to that question a while back.
Okay, and a question I have to ask, you two have worked together on this for 6 years, give or take. How did, I mean, you were both into this issue maybe from different sides of it. How did you happen to come together, and at what point did one of you or both of you say, we should do a book?
Well, I remember it quite clearly because I had seen Terry's laptop in court, and I once noticed that she had something that looked like a book proposal up. And so I wondered if she was writing a book about Arpaio. And as it turned out, it was something that she had tried to do. She'd shopped around in earlier iterations. We were at somebody else's book event, and I'd been covering this Melendra's racial profiling case and thought someone should write a book. So I innocently asked, who's going to write the definitive book about the Arpaio and the racial profiling case? And Terry sort of looked at me and said, you know what, we should. And so that's the moment that it all began.
Yeah, Jude was the only person on the face of the earth that thought that there was a book in this story besides me. I'm pretty sure of it.
And now the book, I mean, it's just terrific on the ground look at this amazing story in Arizona, which has a lot of lessons for the rest of us. And I think we're out of time. It seems like it was a really short talk and we could go on, but Lauren?
Yeah, great. I just wanted to thank you all for this absolutely fantastic conversation. Thank you for your moderation, Robbie. Did you have any final thoughts, Terry or Jude?
Just thank you for this opportunity, and we hope folks will get in touch. We've put our contact information, our websites and Twitter handles. You can contact us both there. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I would just say in solidarity with writers, buy the book and buy it new, and we hope you enjoy it.
Yes, thank you so much. And buy it from us at harvard.com. Yes. Please check out this fantastic book, Purchase Driving While Brown on harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a great rest of your Friday. Please keep reading and be well and safe. Thank you so much. Bye.